This is not just a pipeline. It connects two Israeli cities, but what's so interesting about it is that it used to be known as the Israeli-Iranian Pipeline in the 1970s. After Israel declared independence in 1948, Iran was actually among the first Muslim-majority countries that recognized the new state.
Today, the relationship between Iran and Israel is one of the most hostile rivalries in international politics.
The war between Israel and Iran is a conflict that's been building for decades and is now spiraling out of control. The Israelis began this phase with a huge wave of strikes on June the 13th that have continued for days.
Iran's Revolutionary Guard says it attacked dozens of targets, including military centers and air bases.
Where there was once a silent alliance, today there is one of the world's most dangerous conflicts, capable of changing the fate of the Middle East forever. Iran and Israel began their history as awkward partners, but a twist of fate turned them into eternal archenemies, as we could see in the terrible 12 Days War. But what if I told you they used to be partners? For the past few decades, Israel and Iran have been on opposite ends of the Middle Eastern political map. Today, enmity between the two countries seems inevitable. Cross threats, covert attacks, and bellicose rhetoric are commonplace. However, what many don't realize is that this wasn't always the case. There was a time when Israel and Iran shared strategic interests, discreet diplomatic relations, and even military cooperation. In fact, for nearly 3 decades after the creation of the State of Israel, Iran was one of the few Muslim countries that not only tacitly recognized the new Jewish state, but also maintained functional relations with it. So how did they go from tacit allies to ideological enemies? The answer lies in history, and especially in the political transformation that Iran underwent following the 1979 Islamic Revolution. That event not only redefined the country's domestic politics, but also radically shifted its foreign policy. The new Iranian leadership, headed by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, adopted a staunchly anti-Israel stance, which it began to call Little Satan. But this enmity wasn't always linear. There were moments of pragmatic rapprochement, such as during the Iran-Iraq War, and others of extreme ideological tension, such as under the government of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Over time, what began as a political conflict took on religious, geopolitical, and strategic dimensions. But what could turn two allies into sworn enemies? When the United Nations approved the plan for the partition of the British Mandate of Palestine and the creation of the State of Israel in 1947, most Muslim-majority countries were strongly opposed. The region was the scene of several wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors, and most of the Islamic world cut ties with the new state from its inception. However, Iran was a partial and rather particular exception. Although it did not formally recognize Israel in its early years, under the reign of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran maintained a pragmatic and relatively stable relationship with the Israeli government. In the 1950s, when the Arab-Israeli conflict intensified, Iran opted for a Western-oriented foreign policy, allying itself closely with the United States and positioning itself as one of the bastions of anti-communism in the Middle East. Israel, for its part, was in the midst of national consolidation and sought non-Arab allies in the region. This gave rise to a strategy known as the Periphery Doctrine, by which Israel strengthened ties with non-Arab powers surrounding the hostile Arab world, Turkey, Ethiopia, and of course, Iran. During the 1960s and 1970s, cooperation between the two countries remained silent but effective. Israel assisted Iran in agricultural and infrastructure development, and the two shared strategic intelligence. Iran, for its part, became one of Israel's main suppliers of oil, a vital resource due to the Arab boycott. In return, Israel provided technology, military training, and even advice on security issues. Although the alliance was not public and formal, the two governments maintained commercial and diplomatic relations that, within the regional context, were extraordinary. In Jerusalem, Iran operated an interests office under the cover of a consular representation, and many Israeli businessmen had privileged access to the Iranian market. This relationship served as a key element in the balance of power in the Middle East. So, what happened in 1979 that changed this bond forever? The Islamic Revolution of 1979 marked a radical turning point in Iran's contemporary history, and with it, in its relationship with Israel. The overthrow of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a close ally of the West, marked the beginning of a new political and religious order led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. This movement was not just a change of government, but a profound ideological transformation that immediately broke with previous international relations, especially with the United States and Israel, which were from then on considered ideological and political enemies of the new regime. Khomeini adopted an openly hostile stance toward Israel from the outset. In his political and religious discourse, Israel was identified as the illegitimate Zionist regime, and its existence was considered an affront to the rights of Muslims and a permanent threat to the peoples of the region. The Palestinian cause became a central banner of Iranian revolutionary Islamism, not only as a gesture of solidarity, but also as a central component of its foreign policy. For Tehran, supporting the Palestinian resistance was not just a diplomatic issue, but an expression of its vision of political Islam and the fight against Western influence in the Middle East. One of the new government's first symbolic actions was to close the Israeli office in Tehran and hand it over to the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat. This decision made it clear that the new Iran was not only breaking ties with Israel, but also directly aligning itself with its most bitter enemies. Arafat was one of the first foreign leaders to visit Iran after the revolution, and he was received with honors, reinforcing the ideological alliance that was beginning to consolidate. Khomeini made no secret of his goal of confronting Israel through an indirect strategy based on regional projection. His government began to establish ties with armed groups and Islamist movements opposed to Israel, especially in Lebanon and the Palestinian territories. This approach laid the groundwork for what years later would become known as the Proxy War. Since then, Iran has actively supported groups like Hezbollah and later factions within Hamas, contributing to the escalation of tensions in the region. Despite the incendiary rhetoric of the new Iranian government against Israel following the Islamic Revolution, the 1980s brought a little-known but key geopolitical paradox to understanding the complexity of the relationship between the two countries. In 1980, the Iran-Iraq War broke out, a brutal conflict that lasted 8 years and caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. In this context, and against all apparent logic, Israel indirectly and illegally offered military aid to Iran. Reflective, why would Israel support a country whose government publicly called it its absolute enemy? The answer lies in Jerusalem's strategic perception at the time. Iraq, ruled by Saddam Hussein, was considered a much more immediate and dangerous threat than Iran, even after the revolution. Saddam led a regime with clear regional ambitions, significant military capabilities, and above all, had attacked Israel with missiles in previous conflicts. In contrast, revolutionary Iran, although hostile in rhetoric, was isolated, weakened by its internal transformation, and at war with a common enemy. Informative. Under this logic, Israel covertly collaborated with the sale of weapons, spare parts, and military technology to Iran. It did so through intermediaries and secret channels, in coordination with sectors within the US government itself, in what would later be known as the Iran-Contra scandal. Between 1981 and 1986, Israel supplied Iran with anti-tank missiles, aircraft parts, and spare parts that the Iranian army desperately needed. In return, Iran reportedly offered to guarantee the security of Jewish communities on its territory and maintain an open channel of communication, although no diplomatic understanding was ever formalized. This collaboration, while pragmatic, was deeply contradictory. On the one hand, the Iranian regime continued to use fierce rhetoric against Israel, supporting the PLO and denouncing the Zionist regime. On the other hand, it accepted military aid that allowed it to resist the Iraqi offensive. On the Israeli side, the strategy was framed by the logic that keeping Iraq weakened was more urgent than combating Iranian ideology. This, the enemy of my enemy is my friend tactic, demonstrated how fluid and circumstantial alliances can be in Middle Eastern geopolitics. However, once the Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988, any semblance of tactical cooperation evaporated completely. Iran emerged from the war more radicalized, more committed to its role as the leader of political Islam, and with a renewed determination to project its regional influence. Enmity toward Israel once again took center stage in its foreign policy, now accompanied by a more robust military apparatus and a growing network of regional allies. The period of silent support for strategic convenience remained a brief, ambiguous, and, in many ways, awkward episode for both sides. Following the death of Ruhollah Khomeini in 1989, Iran's political structure underwent a key transition. The position of supreme leader was assumed by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who had previously been president. From that moment on, Khamenei consolidated religious and military power in his hands and established a leadership model characterized by strict control of institutions and a long-term strategic vision. Regarding Israel, his position remained unchanged from that of his predecessor. He considered Israel an illegitimate government and maintained support for the Palestinian and Lebanese armed resistance movements as a central axis of his foreign policy. Under his leadership, ties with Hezbollah deepened, and resources allocated to expanding Iranian influence in the region increased. However, the 1990s also saw an apparent ideological contrast within the regime itself. In 1997, Mohammad Khatami was elected president of the Islamic Republic. Considered a moderate reformer, Khatami promoted a discourse of dialogue among civilizations and sought to open a path to understanding with the West. During his term, he avoided confrontational statements toward Israel, and some sectors of his government even proposed toning down the ideological rhetoric. However, his powers were limited. Strategic foreign policy, especially regarding national security and relations with Israel, was in the hands of the supreme leader and military forces such as the Revolutionary Guards. Thus, Khatami had little real leeway to alter the hostile course toward Israel, although his presidency served to show a more moderate face of the Iranian regime to the international community. During these years, Iran continued its indirect strategy of confrontation, supporting Hezbollah during the conflicts in southern Lebanon, financing Palestinian armed factions, and expanding its networks of influence in Syria. Israel, for its part, viewed with growing concern Hezbollah's military buildup and the growing technological capabilities of the pro-Iranian axis. It sounds like it couldn't get any worse, or could it? Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's rise to the presidency of Iran in 2005 marked a notable hardening of the regime's rhetoric and foreign policy toward Israel. Unlike the more moderate speech that had characterized Mohammad Khatami's government, Ahmadinejad adopted an openly confrontational and provocative stance. On multiple occasions, he questioned the legitimacy of the State of Israel and even stated that it should be wiped off the map, a widely circulated phrase that drew international condemnation. Although some sectors in Iran later attempted to qualify the translation, the message was clear. Hostility toward Israel was no longer merely ideological, but had become part of the state's official diplomatic language. During his 2 terms, Ahmadinejad also positioned himself as a Holocaust denier. He organized international conferences in Tehran, questioning the extent or even the existence of the Nazi genocide, sparking worldwide outrage and deepening Iran's diplomatic isolation. In Israel, these actions were interpreted not only as an act of historic provocation, but as a direct threat to the Jewish people. The Israeli government then intensified its efforts in international forums to denounce the threat posed by Iran under Ahmadinejad, both ideologically and militarily. At the same time, the development of Iran's nuclear program accelerated, with the installation of centrifuges and uranium enrichment plants that raised alarm in the West. Israel, which for years had considered Iran's nuclear program an existential threat, began developing cyber attack and sabotage strategies, such as the well-known Stuxnet virus, unofficially attributed to a joint Israeli-US operation. This episode marked the beginning of a silent cyber war, in which both countries participated without formally declaring it, but with clear objectives, to delay Iran's nuclear advance. This shadow war deepened in the following decade, especially in Syria, where Israel launched numerous airstrikes against Iranian convoys and weapons depots destined for Hezbollah. These covert operations, which continued from 2011 well into the 2020s, shaped Iran's military calculations and limited its ability to project power into the Mediterranean. In parallel, a more direct and lethal campaign began, the targeted assassination of scientists linked to Iran's nuclear program. The most well-known case was that of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, killed in 2020 in an attack that Iran attributed to Israel. These assassinations, never officially claimed, dramatically heightened tensions between the two countries and consolidated the perception in Tehran that Israel was willing to operate without limits. During this same period, the regional balance began to shift with an unexpected diplomatic shift. In 2020, the Abraham Accords marked the normalization of relations between Israel and several Arab states, such as the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, with the endorsement of the United States. Iran viewed this rapprochement as a strategic betrayal and a direct threat to its regional influence, as it broke with pan-Arab solidarity regarding the Palestinian cause and reinforced Iran's isolation in the face of a new regional alliance. Another key point was the nuclear agreement known as the JCPOA, signed in 2015 between Iran and 6 world powers. Israel strongly opposed the pact from the outset, believing it offered excessive concessions to Tehran in exchange for insufficient guarantees. This opposition was clearly manifested on the international stage, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu even expressing his warnings at the UN General Assembly. In 2018, US President Donald Trump decided to withdraw from the agreement, partly due to Israeli pressure. Later, under President Joe Biden, attempts were made to revive the pact, albeit with limited progress. At every stage, Israel continued to lobby against any deal it considered dangerous to its national security. At the same time, Iran began to develop a new strategic weapon, its drone and precision missile capabilities. Since 2021, these systems have become key tools of influence, used by Iranian allies such as Hezbollah, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and even by Russia in the conflict in Ukraine. This deployment multiplies Iran's reach and deterrent capability while expanding the field of confrontation with Israel, which views these technologies as a direct threat to its internal security. In Israel, policy toward Iran has been strongly influenced by Netanyahu and his successive right-wing governments. His rhetoric has revolved around the need to act preemptively in the face of the Iranian nuclear threat, pressuring the international community and leaving open the possibility of a unilateral attack on nuclear facilities. This stance has been maintained by various Israeli governments, but it reached its strongest point during Netanyahu's terms, where the narrative of existential danger has been a constant both in domestic politics and on the global diplomatic scene. During this period, the enmity between Israel and Iran became more explicit, more public, and more dangerous. It was no longer just rhetoric or indirect support for regional actors, but a confrontational dynamic involving open threats, expanding military programs, covert assassinations, and high-precision sabotage operations. Israel began preparing its public opinion for the possibility of a direct conflict, conducting military exercises simulating preemptive strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. In parallel, Iran expanded its network of regional influence, strengthening its alliance with Syria and Hezbollah, and establishing a presence in conflicts such as Iraq and the Syrian civil war. Ahmadinejad's term marked the beginning of a period of extreme polarization, but it was in the following decade that this polarization became institutionalized. Thus, any possibility of détente was ruled out, giving way to a long-standing structural rivalry that was increasingly dangerous to the stability of the Middle East. Today, the rivalry has transcended the regional to acquire a technological and global component. All these tensions led to the so-called 12-Day War, which took place between June 13th and 24, 2025, and consisted of an intense exchange of missiles that left hundreds dead and thousands wounded. Despite the halt in bombing campaigns, the fragile truce brokered by the United States hangs in the balance, as annoyances with the Netanyahu government increase in the Arab region. It unlocks this was the last exchange of violence. Unlike other diplomatic conflicts, the enmity between Israel and Iran has crystallized in the military and strategic doctrine of both countries. For Israel, containing Iran is a state objective. For Iran, confronting it is part of its revolutionary identity. Unfortunately, the Middle East is a region simmering with tension, and all parties involved believe that greater power compels them to destroy their neighbors. If you found this analysis valuable, please consider subscribing to Ceasefire Now for more deep dives into global geopolitics. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop your comments below and let us know your perspective on this rivalry, or suggest topics you want us to cover next. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episode.